Well, there are more than 24 Republicans sponsoring House Bill 312. It would separate concealed carry licenses into two categories, provisional and standard. The provisional license to carry a concealed firearm would be for people 18 to 20 years old. State police would have to keep up with the expiration of provisional licenses. They would also have to allow provisional license holders a way to later apply for a standard license. The governor does not like this bill. He vetoed it the same day he attended an event honoring his friend who was killed in the Old National Bank shooting in Louisville, writing, "While I believe in the Second Amendment, Kentuckians under age 21 cannot rent a car, cannot buy alcohol, cannot buy tobacco products, cannot consume medical cannabis through vapor devices, and cannot be a state representative or senator. Laws setting these minimum age limits are meant to protect our youth." There is an amendment to this bill that would require the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet to make annual reports on concealed carry related incidents. Part of the criticism of the bill is a fear of more shootings. The amendment would require tracking of shootings in an annual review. With this WKYT Fact Check, I'm Kristen Kennedy.